Hi everyone, and welcome to our 7th workshop in the workshop series for Oxford Schools 2022. I'm David, your 5th and final CA for this year's edition of Oxford Schools, and today I'm going to be giving a workshop on how to do principled argumentation within debating. If you haven't seen our other workshops in this series, I'd recommend going and checking them out. They cover some more basic topics and are generally pretty useful, but you don't need to have seen them in order to understand this workshop, so if you want to jump in for this one specifically, that'll be totally fine. The reason I've chosen to do principles for my workshop is because I think that debaters often perceive them, especially at the schools level, as arguments that are harder to prove, or they're just not too familiar with how to make principled arguments within debating. And I think this kind of perception of them being hard, or perhaps even less important than practical arguments, is totally untrue. And so with this workshop, I'd quite like to dispel some of these myths about principled arguments and hopefully make them seem more accessible and something that you could actually see yourself using in future debates that you have. So more specifically, this workshop will cover 4 things. Firstly, I'm going to go through what principled arguments are and why you should use them. Secondly, I'm going to go through concrete examples of some principles we might care about within debating, because I think principles can often seem quite abstract or just a bit wishy-washy and we're not that sure what we're talking about. So I think honing in on some specific examples will be helpful. Thirdly, I'm going to go through how to make principled arguments in a good amount of detail, and I'm going to use a worked example for that of the motion, "This house would allow people to buy and sell human organs." And then fourthly, I'm going to talk about how to respond and argue against principled arguments when they're made against you by the other side. So firstly, what are principled arguments and why should you care about them? So there's probably 2 types of arguments within debating. There's consequentialist arguments and there's deontological or principled arguments. Consequentialist arguments, or consequentialism, is just the view that what determines whether an action is right or wrong is only its consequences. That's the only thing that matters. So there's no action that is off limits. I'm perfectly permitted to steal or do any other traditionally or typically, say, immoral action, so long as it leads to good consequences in the case in which I'm doing it. With that view in mind, a nice way to think about principled arguments is to just contrast it against that view of consequentialism. So principled arguments say things other than consequences can matter and often give categorical rules, i.e. rules that apply in all cases, or note the importance of duties. So for example, a deontological theory or a principled argument may be that murder is always wrong. So even if there's a case where murder would lead to good consequences for society and others that outweigh the bad consequence of the murder, it's still wrong to murder, you ought not do it. Or it may note special obligations you have to your family, for instance. So let's say you're in a position where you can only save 2 strangers or 1 close family member. Most consequentialist views are going to say you have to save 2 strangers because it's 2 lives rather than 1, so the consequences are, twice as bad or something like that. But a deontological theory or principle might say, actually, no, you have some sort of special obligation to family members. You have obligations to your children and perhaps other family members. And therefore, if you're in this sort of situation, it's perfectly morally permissible and perhaps even morally obligatory to save your family member over the strangers. And that's quite all right. And so if you share that kind of intuition, you might think that you hold some principle views in this kind of area. So those are the 2 types of arguments. We do not automatically prefer one of these over the other. I think sometimes debaters have a fear that you have some kind of additional analytical burden to prove when you make a principled argument that it actually matters at all or we should care about it. This is not true. We take consequentialist arguments and principled arguments as equally valid. You should weigh both of them, but if they're not weighed, we will treat them equally. And there's no kind of preference for consequentialist arguments or arguments that have kind of concrete real-world impacts. As I mentioned at the top, I think schools debates often lack principled arguments, which means if you learn the skill, it's a whole different type of argument that you can add to your repertoire. So if you sometimes struggle with thinking of enough arguments for debates or perhaps an extension, you struggle to come up with new arguments, this can be a really useful skill set to have because it's a whole new type of argument. But secondly, it also means that people who in schools debating often aren't very good at dealing with principles when they come up. So if you learn the skill set and other people don't have it, you can gain a tactical advantage from knowing it and being able to do principles because people will struggle to respond to you from my experience. So here's a few examples of principles to get a bit less abstract and hone in on exactly what we're talking about here. I'll go through 3, but this list is by no means exhaustive. So please don't take it as such. There's loads of principles you can run with in debating, and this is just a few to give you a rough idea. So firstly, you might think you have some kind of principle of bodily autonomy or human dignity, or something like this. So one example, which may motivate the importance of a principle like this, is the case where you're able to steal someone's organs in order to save 5 other people. So this thought experiment asks us to imagine that there is someone who doesn't really have any family or friends, they're quite an unpleasant person, a bit rotten, and they are luckily or perhaps unluckily a match for 5 other people who need critical organs. So these 5 other people are good people, they have family, friends, contribute to society, maybe they have good careers being doctors and helping people around them. And unfortunately, they're all quite low down on the wait list for the various organs they need, and so they're not going to get one in time, and they're going to pass away if they do not get these organs. The rotten person then comes into the hospital or doctors or whatever, and the doctor could, and therefore has the option to kill them, take their organs, and give it to these 5 other people who need them and save their lives. So he's saving 5 lives and only ending 1, and 5 lives that have positive externalities as well, insofar as they help their family and these sorts of things. So the question of this case is then, is it morally permissible, or perhaps even is it morally good for the doctor to kill the one person, take their organs, and save 5 other lives? Now, if you think the answer is no, that this is not okay, as I think most of you will, then you probably value or have some kind of principle or importance that you put on bodily autonomy or human dignity, right? The reason you probably think that or have that intuition is because you think that people have a kind of special ownership over their bodies, or perhaps even a right to life and a right to exist. And this right cannot be violated, even if it would lead to good consequences, even if it would lead to more lives being saved overall. You cannot violate this specific right and principle. And therefore, perhaps the reason that you think the way you do about this is because you actually put some value on this sort of principle about bodily autonomy or respect for humans or something of this nature. So a second example of a principle would be more with regard to groups, would be something like reparations. So for example, if money has been stolen in the past from a country, either directly or indirectly through processes of colonialization or something else, or political representation has been denied in the past to certain groups, such as women or a racial minority, then we might think that we have special obligations to these groups in order to give them reparations for the terrible things that have happened in the past. This is a principle that we might have irrespective of whether we could do even better things with the money or even better things with the kind of political capital necessary to get this. So we might say, or even if the whatever it was led to more bad consequences as a result of giving the money for some reason, we might think that these kind of bad consequences are not important because the person or group is owed this resource, right? They are owed these resources or representation. And so regardless of whether it's good or bad in the end of the day, or regardless of whether we could do even better things with the money, because they are owed it, we still have a principled obligation to do this. So to give it a more specific example here, perhaps you have a sum of money and you're paying reparations to a particular group. You could donate that money to a group that technically needs it more, and you can maybe save more lives buying malaria bed nets or something. But if it's the case that this money was stolen from this other group, then you would probably say you have a principled moral obligation to give the money back to this group rather than spending it in the best way you can. So if you share this intuition that if money is stolen from a person or group, that you should not do like the best thing in terms of consequences, but rather give it back to the person you stole it from because of this like kind of special obligation, then it might be that you care about reparations or have some kind of value for principles about special obligations between people. A third example then of a principle would be to do with the state and it having special obligations to citizens. So most people think that states and governments around the world have these some kind of obligation to help people around the world. This is why most developed countries give some aid to countries that are poorer than them in order to help them develop and help alleviate poverty and things. But you might also think that the state or government has an bigger obligation to the citizens over which it rules. So one reason you might think this is because of some kind of principle about fairness, that if you demand more from me, I can demand more from you. And this is a kind of principle that seems intuitive and kind of personal level, but it would also apply to states, because the state has special abilities to force its citizens over which it rules to pay taxes or force them to go to war for them, whereas it cannot do that to citizens who are in other parts of the world. So therefore, perhaps it's the case that the state has special obligations to its citizens in particular. And if you find that sort of argument appealing, then perhaps this is another sort of area in which you find you have some principled intuitions about what is the right thing to do in certain cases. But again, this is by no means exhaustive. Please be creative within debates. You can create new principles that seem quite specific. The kind of general goal you just need to hit is you're looking for a rule that we either follow in the real world or that it seems intuitively right to follow, and saying that applies in the case of the debate, that this is something that we ought to do. If this, then this. Don't be afraid to try things out with this. It might work, but it might not work, but you might learn things in the process and be better at making principled arguments because you're practicing and actually trying it out. Okay, so now we know why we want to make principled arguments. We know what they are, and we have a few examples. How do we actually go about proving and making principled arguments when you're in a debate? The first step is to just state the principal claim that you're trying to push. And you want to have sort of two versions of this. You want to have the version that you say as the headline to your argument, where you say, this is what the point of this argument is. It's like the title. And then you also want to have a secondary kind of version of the principle in your head, which is like a one-sentence, slightly longer summary of what the claim is that you're trying to advance. So for example, in this house would allow people to buy and sell human organs, your claim might be, you have a right to bodily autonomy, and your right to bodily autonomy includes a right to sell your organs, so it's principally illegitimate to ban you from doing so. And that would be the overall claim and structure of the principled argument that you're trying to advance in the debate. But when you actually give the debate, you want a snappier version of this so that the judge knows where you're going but doesn't need all this detail. So you just want to start your principled argument saying, firstly, I'm going to talk about how it's principally obligatory in respecting human autonomy that this be allowed under the motion, or something like that. And that's a little headline for your argument and the best place to start so that it's clear to the judge where you're going with this. Step 2, and this is the most important. If you do this step well, the other steps will follow quite logically and without you having to do too much more work. So this is the kind of stage to spend the most time on in your argument. So the second step is to intuition pump, is what debaters sometimes say, or you might hear judges say, but it's really just a silly debate word that means give examples to prove the existence of a principle in general. So what you want to do is give intuitive examples in the real world where we respect a certain thing or follow a certain principle and say, look, this shows that we do value autonomy in the real world in a way where we're willing to respect it, even in cases where there might be worse consequences, for example. Or this could also be with certain principles around justice, saying that, like, look, we have all these other practices in the world that embody this principle, and this is why this principle exists in kind of abstract before we talk about the motion. So you want to, you want to basically prove that we, in the organs debate, for example, you want to prove that we grant people this level of autonomy in other cases, and that autonomy is important and usually respected regardless of consequences. So, for example, you might say, look, we allow you to sell your body into labor when you do manual work or when you go work for a company or whatever, even if you might hurt yourself in the process. So it might be that you're taking on risk and leading to bad consequences when you do this, but because you own your body, we let you sell that and sell your labor by doing work in order to earn an income. And that's something that we allow you to do because we respect your autonomy, even if going into that job is too dangerous or not a good idea for you. A second example to prove that we respect autonomy even when it leads to bad decisions or bad outcomes, which is sort of the principle we want to get at with the in this kind of organs debate, is that we generally allow you to do what you want with your body when you're not hurting others, even if this involves taking a significant risk, such as wanting to skydive, right? We don't prevent people from doing this, even if it's not in their interests, even if it might lead to bad consequences for them, we still allow them to do what they want with their body. And so this is an example that intuitively shows we still prioritize autonomy, even when there's bad consequences or bad consequences in expectation, i.e. like this is what we think might happen, or it's just overall expected to be a negative experience. A third example would be kind of the flip side, looking at it more negatively, is the state or government can't force you to work 12 hours a day, even if that would have really good consequences. So instead of allowing people to do things in this example, we're talking about forcing you to do things. So it might be the case that if we could force our top scientists and researchers and doctors to work 12 hours a day, then that will lead to lots of good consequences, lots of economic growth, and things that would be really beneficial for society. But because we respect autonomy, we cannot force these people to work 12 hours a day, even if that will lead to good consequences, because we respect this principle. So what these three examples do is in your sort of second stage or first main substantive stage of the argument, you're saying, look, these are lots of cases where we care about autonomy, even at the expense of good consequences, or even when it's going to lead to bad consequences. And therefore, you're showing that we care about this principle in general. So step 3 then is to prove that this motion is a case of that principle. Because you proved the principle exists in general, second stages show that the debate is an example of the principle. So for example, continuing the organs debate is, therefore, you should be allowed to sell your organs because this is another situation exactly like the other intuitive examples I've described. Even if this leads to bad consequences for your health, the principle of autonomy means that we must allow you to do this as we do with skydiving or smoking or other choices. The goal here overall is to make it sound exactly like the other cases, because what you do when you make the perhaps unintuitive case of the motion, where you allow people to sell their organs, sound like these other cases we think are intuitive, like allowing people to skydive or smoke, is you build up the kind of defenses of your argument that the other side has to break down if they want to argue against it. Because most people think it should be allowed to skydive. Therefore, if you've shown it's like being allowed to skydive, they now have to argue against that example, which is much more intuitive to the judge and therefore much harder to argue against. And so that is kind of what you're doing when you're comparing it to these other examples. You're showing it's like these, and so you should think the same thing about it if you want to be consistent. Step 4 is to explain why your principle is important. So as I mentioned before, we don't prioritize consequentialist arguments, but we also don't prioritize principled arguments. So you still need to do weighing and explain why you should care about the principle within the debate. Part of this can rely a bit on rhetoric and just kind of using your language in order to communicate the importance of something. Like you can just talk about why justice is important, why fairness is important, why it's important that we respect people's autonomy and their right to live their life how they want. And that's, part of what you can do to weigh. But another useful tip is to build in kind of implicit weighing with your examples. And this is what you can achieve if you do the work in step 2 with the intuition pumping. You can say that even if allowing people to do what they like leads to a worse life to them, you principally must be able to do what you want with your own body. Now, that's what we've been saying in the examples, but the effect that has is it already weighs against any consequences-based argument that the other side bring. Because if you make this argument and then they come up and say, but look, it's going to really harm your health, it's going to be really detrimental for you if we let people sell their organs, this argument is no longer relevant because you've already done the analytical work to show that this principle applies even if this is actively a bad choice. And so by doing that, you've already weighed it against other practical arguments in the debate, and that makes your principle more important in comparison to them. So that's quite a useful thing to do and something you should kind of prioritize when you make principled arguments. Step 5 is somewhat optional, but it can make your principle kind of stronger if you do the work on it and kind of makes it have a greater impact. And that is basically just to deal with the obvious problem cases for your principle. Because all principles have counterexamples, right? And so one thing you can do is think, what counterexamples would I give to this principle if I was on the other side? And if you can think of them and then build in preemption in the same way you would for a practical or consequentialist argument into your argument, about the counterexamples the other side may bring up, then that will make your principle far stronger. So for example, in the organs debate, I think one quite obvious counterexample that may come to mind is that perhaps it's the case that we allow people to do dangerous things that might lead to some bad consequences because we respect autonomy. But if something's really harmful, then we still ban it. So for example, with hard drugs or not wearing a seatbelt in a car, these are both things that are very harmful. And so perhaps there's some threshold of harm that once it's surpassed, we now prioritize that over the principle of autonomy. And perhaps then it's the case that the organs situation is exactly like that because it's so detrimental to your health. This is quite an obvious counterexample to the principle in general that we allow people to do what they want. But you can build a response into this, into your principled argument, and say, oh, well, I think the other side's obviously going to say this in response, but here's why it doesn't apply. So one way to kind of make your principle stronger. So one way you might do this is, for example, you might say, actually, no, these cases aren't counterexamples, because these things are illegal because they hurt other people. And we do actually allow people to do riskier things that have a very high expectation of harm, like climbing Mount Everest, for example, which have a mortality rate of like 1 in 10 or something like that. And so it's not actually a counterexample because there's a different reason these things are illegal. So in the case of hard drugs, there's the kind of negative externalities associated with people committing crime to maybe fuel their addictions, or the harm it does to kind of those around them, or the creating kind of gangs and these sorts of things. And in the case of not wearing a seatbelt, it's the case that when you crash and you're not wearing a seatbelt, you're more likely to go through the windscreen and hit other passengers and hurt them in serious car collisions, which increases the chance of fatality. So you could say, actually, those are the reasons that these cases are illegal. It's not because it causes too much harm to the individual. We have cases that cause a lot of harm to the individual that we allow, like the Mount Everest case. It's because there's a different reason these are illegal. And if you build this into the principle, it becomes a lot stronger, because there's then not this counterexample that they can throw at your case to kind of cast doubt on it, because you've already built in the response to this. So that's something that you can do if you want to make your principled argument really strong. How then can we respond to principled arguments when they're made against us in debating? I think there's 3 broad methods that are the most effective, which I'll go through now. So firstly, I think you can show that the principle does not apply in this case. This is like the example I just gave, where we're giving a counterexample to the principle. So when you give a response saying that the principle doesn't apply in this case, you sort of want to structure your response in the same way we structured the principle. You want to firstly give cases where we restrict the original principle, and then secondly, explain why the motion is like one of those cases. So it's the same structure of doing it in general and then showing the motion is like it. So, for example, we limit the kind of right to freedom of speech when you are shouting fire in a cinema, because this would lead to so much harm that we're willing to kind of restrict the principle there and say, no, that's kind of where it ends. And so if you can then show that the motion is like one of these cases where there's a cutoff, then you can use that to refute it and say, yes, we agree with the principle in general, but it should not apply in this debate. And that's an effective way to rebut a principle. The second way you can respond to principled arguments is to co-opt the principle. So if you are struggling to rebut the principle or show it doesn't apply to the debate, then you can instead agree with the principle and explain why you're fulfilling it better. So, for example, if we had a debate again about something with reparations, there are multiple ways to give reparations to a group that deserve it. We can give them political representation, but we can also give them money or other things. And therefore, if one side is saying, we think we have a principled obligation to give reparations to a particular group, you can say, and we should do this by giving them money, say, you can say, we agree that you should do this, but because of X, Y, and Z, the better way to give reparations and give back what was taken away is to give political representation. And in that way, you're saying, we agree with all the stuff about the principle, but the better way to fulfill it is with this means rather than their means of money, right? And by doing that, then you can use their principle against them almost and say, look, we're fulfilling it even better than they are, which can mean you win that kind of principle clash within the debate. The third method for responding to principle arguments is weighing their principle either against other principles or against other considerations in general. So, for example, in a debate about counterterrorism measures, one side will probably say that you have a right to privacy. And you can agree with that on the other side. You can say, yes, we think you do have a right to privacy. But perhaps you have other rights or other principle kind of obligations that ought to be respected more so than this right to privacy, namely the right to life. Because if it's the case that counterterrorism measures will lead to more lives being saved, then we can protect the right to life, which you might think is a more important right than the right to privacy. So one reason you could give for that when you're weighing your principle is you could say, look, privacy is important, but the right to life is prior to other rights, right? Because in order to achieve having privacy or these other things we find principally valuable, you have to be alive in the first place, right? So this is kind of a prior right to the other ones being able to happen. And so you should weigh it more heavily, since it allows you to access the other things that we find important in the world. And that might be some reasoning or weighing that you give for why we should prioritize the right to life in this case, rather than the right to privacy. And what you're doing here is you're not saying we don't have a right to privacy, you're just saying we have a more important right. And you could also do similar things, weighing your their principle against utility considerations. So there's like famous cases, for example, where although people have a right not to be tortured, if the consequences of them not being tortured would be so vast, then perhaps that can eventually outweigh the principle, because you can show it's beyond the bounds of where the principle actually lies if, you know, 1 million people are going to die as a result or something. So I think those are the 3 best ways that you can respond to principles, and what I'd recommend there. Okay, so kind of concluding remark is principles are fun, use them. We'd like to see a lot more of them at schools this year. This is the last workshop in the series, although we've got a live workshop tomorrow, which I'll be at, so hopefully see some of you there. But I hope you found these recorded workshops really useful, and the best of luck to everyone at their regional rounds, and hope to see you at finals day. Bye-bye, everyone.